On a storm-lashed Tuesday night, Caleb Monroe discovered two strangers collapsed outside his garage, a battered woman and a silent boy who clutched her hand like a lifeline. No identification, no explanation, just terror etched in their eyes. He intended to help for one night, maybe two. But their arrival would shatter his carefully guarded world and reveal a truth that could either save them all or destroy everything he'd fought to protect. Caleb Monroe had learned to measure his days in small victories and smaller defeats. At 39, he carried the weight of widowhood like a second skin, moving through his world with the careful precision of a man who had already lost everything that mattered most. His wife Sarah had died in a house fire 3 years ago, a blaze he couldn't reach in time, despite all his training as a volunteer firefighter. The flames had taken her while he was 3 miles away, responding to a different emergency, trusting that their neighborhood was safe because fires always happened to other people in other places. Now he lived in the space between memory and survival, raising his 8-year-old daughter Josie in a converted apartment above Monroe's auto repair, the garage that barely kept them afloat financially, but provided the isolation he craved emotionally. The building had been Sarah's idea. Originally, she'd seen potential in the abandoned service station on the edge of town, had drawn up plans for renovating the upper floor into a cozy family home. After her death, Caleb had completed the project, not out of hope, but out of stubborn determination to honor her vision, even as every corner of their living space reminded him of conversations they would never finish and dreams they would never share. The night shift suited him perfectly. While Josie slept safely upstairs, protected by multiple locks and a security system that he checked obsessively, he could lose himself in the honest work of fixing what was broken, finding solace in problems that had solutions. His hands, scarred from years of rescue work and now stained permanently with motor oil, moved with practiced efficiency across engines and transmissions. These machines didn't judge him for the times he woke screaming from dreams of smoke and flames, didn't ask why he no longer volunteered for the fire department, didn't wonder why he kept everyone at arm's length. Loneliness had become his most faithful companion, as reliable as sunrise and just as inevitable. Josie tried valiantly to fill the silence with her endless chatter about school friends and playground adventures, but Caleb could see the questions forming in her bright blue eyes, questions about why Daddy never smiled anymore, why they never visited Mommy's grave together, why he flinched whenever she hugged him too suddenly or laughed too loudly. He loved her with a fierce desperation that sometimes frightened him in its intensity, but he had built walls so high around his heart that even his own daughter couldn't fully climb them. The isolation served a purpose beyond mere self-protection. Caleb had convinced himself that emotional distance was a form of insurance policy. If he didn't allow himself to care too deeply about anything or anyone beyond Josie, then loss couldn't destroy him again. He kept his interactions with customers brief and professional, declined invitations to neighborhood barbecues and school functions, and maintained the kind of polite but distant relationships that prevented anyone from getting close enough to matter. It was a strategy that had worked for 3 years, keeping his small family safe in their bubble of careful routine and controlled expectations. The woman he found that night challenged everything he thought he knew about safety and distance. She was beautiful despite the bruises that painted her face in shades of purple and yellow, her long dark hair matted with rain and something that might have been blood. Her clothes were expensive, he could tell, even in their torn and muddied state designer fabric and careful tailoring that spoke of wealth and privilege. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold when she briefly regained consciousness. They held a depth of terror that reminded him of his own reflection in those first months after Sarah's death, the look of someone who had seen their world collapse and couldn't quite believe they had survived the destruction. The boy, Max, clung to her unconscious form with the desperate grip of someone who had already lost too much. His wide green eyes tracked every movement Caleb made, flinching at sudden sounds, ready to run or fight despite his small size and obvious exhaustion. There was something hauntingly familiar about that look, the same expression Josie had worn in the weeks after her mother's funeral, when she would wake up screaming and search every room to make sure Daddy was still there, that he hadn't disappeared into smoke and flames like Mommy had. The child's clothes told a story similar to his mother's, expensive but practical, designed for a life of privilege, but now bearing the signs of rough travel and desperate circumstances. His shoes were high-end sneakers that had probably cost more than Caleb made in a week, but they were worn thin from walking, mud-caked and torn. The boy carried a small backpack that he clutched protectively, never letting it out of reach, and Caleb caught glimpses of what looked like important papers wrapped in plastic bags. Caleb's first instinct was to call the police, a response drilled into him from years of emergency training and civic responsibility. But something held him back as he studied the pair more carefully. Maybe it was the way Max had positioned himself protectively over the woman, or the expensive medical bandaging he glimpsed beneath her torn sleeve, too professional and recent for a typical domestic violence situation. Maybe it was his own hard-earned distrust of systems that promised help but often delivered more pain, bureaucracy, that could separate families and create more trauma than it prevented. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized the look of people who had nowhere else to go and no one else to trust. He carried the woman to the small couch in his office while Max shadowed his every step, never more than an arm's length away from her side. Her pulse was steady, her breathing regular exhaustion more than serious injury, he decided with his old EMT training automatically kicking in. The boy accepted a blanket and a glass of milk but never spoke, just watched with those two old eyes that had seen far more than any 6-year-old should ever witness. When Caleb offered food, Max carefully tested everything first, a behavior that suggested experience with people who might try to drug or poison him. That first night, Caleb sat in his desk chair, listening to their breathing settle into the rhythm of exhausted sleep, and wondered what he had invited into his carefully controlled world. He had spent 3 years building a life where nothing unexpected could touch them, where routine and isolation kept both him and Josie safe from the kind of loss that could destroy what remained of their small family. Now these strangers slept in his office, and he found himself remembering what it felt like to need something more than mere survival, to have a purpose beyond simply getting through each day without falling apart. Morning light streaming through the garage windows revealed more questions than answers. The woman, who still hadn't given her name or offered any explanation for their presence, moved through his space with unconscious grace, tidying areas that hadn't been clean in months. She found ingredients in his sparse kitchen that he had forgotten he owned, creating a breakfast that filled the air with warmth and the kind of domestic comfort he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Her hands, though bearing the telltale signs of recent trauma and medical treatment, worked with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking care of others, to managing complex situations with efficiency and grace. Max remained silent throughout the morning, but Caleb watched him watching Josie with a mixture of longing and wariness that broke his heart. His daughter, bless her resilient and generous heart, seemed determined to coax the boy out of his shell, sharing her cereal and chattering about her favorite cartoons with the easy acceptance that children possessed before the world taught them to be afraid of differences. Yet Max's responses were always delayed, as if he was translating every interaction through a filter of fear and suspicion, checking each gesture and word for potential threats. The expensive shoes gave Caleb pause as he observed them more carefully in daylight Italian leather, he thought, though scuffed and torn from hard travel. The woman's movements spoke of education and privilege, the way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion, suggesting someone accustomed to authority and responsibility. But it was the small details that truly unsettled him, the way she automatically checked the locks on all the doors, how she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with every entrance, the almost professional way she assessed his garage for potential escape routes and defensive positions. There were other signs that didn't fit the profile of typical domestic violence victims. The woman's injuries, while extensive, showed signs of professional medical treatment, proper suturing, high-quality bandages, medication that required prescriptions. Her hands were soft despite their current condition, speaking of a life that hadn't involved manual labor until recently. And Max, despite his fear and silence, displayed the kind of sophisticated vocabulary and careful manners that suggested expensive private education and a privileged upbringing. On the second night, Caleb found Max huddled under the desk in his office, trembling at the sound of distant sirens from an ambulance racing down the main highway. The boy's panic was absolute and primal, his small body shaking as if the sound itself could physically harm him. It took 20 minutes of gentle coaxing before Max would emerge from his hiding place, and even then he remained pressed against the wall, eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting pursuers to appear at any moment. The terror was too specific, too practiced. This wasn't a child's general fear of loud noises, but someone who had learned to associate sirens with immediate danger. The woman, Elena, she finally whispered when Caleb brought Max a warm cup of cocoa and sat patiently beside them, moved to comfort the boy with practiced ease. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the refined accent of East Coast privilege, but underneath lay something harder, more desperate. She sang softly to Max in what sounded like a lullaby, but Caleb caught fragments that chilled him. Something about helicopters and needles, about men in white coats who made people disappear, about staying quiet and staying hidden until the danger passed. Sleep eluded Caleb that night as his mind raced through possibilities and implications. He found himself researching missing persons reports on his ancient computer, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was looking for. The woman was clearly educated, probably wealthy based on the remnants of her clothing and her unconscious bearing, and the boy showed signs of trauma that went far beyond typical domestic abuse. But it was Max's whispered words from the night before that haunted him most. "I don't want to go on the helicopter anymore. I'm scared they'll give Mommy more shots." His old contacts from the fire department proved useful in ways he hadn't expected. Danny Rodriguez, now working dispatch for the county sheriff's office, owed him more than one favor from their volunteer days when Caleb had pulled him from a burning warehouse. A casual conversation about missing persons and recent cases led to information that made Caleb's blood run cold. Elena Ward, wife of recently deceased oil heir Marcus Ward, had been officially declared dead in a helicopter crash in Texas 3 months ago, along with her 6-year-old son Maxwell. Yet here they sat in his garage, very much alive and very much terrified. The official reports spoke of mechanical failure, of wreckage scattered across remote ranchland, of bodies too damaged by fire to recover intact remains. The investigation had been brief and conclusive, handled by federal authorities with assistance from Ward Industries' own security team. But if Elena and Max had died in that crash, then who were the people sleeping in his office? And why was someone so determined to convince the world they were dead? The pieces began forming a picture that terrified him more than any fire he had ever fought. Marcus Ward's death 6 months earlier had been ruled accidental, a diving incident off the coast of Florida, though rumors in financial circles suggested the young heir had been investigating irregularities in his family's oil empire. Elena's subsequent hospitalization for grief-induced psychological trauma had been brief and private, handled by the family's personal physicians at an exclusive facility. And now, according to official records, both she and her son had perished in what was being called a tragic accident. But accidents, Caleb knew from his years fighting fires and responding to emergencies, rarely came in such convenient timing. Someone wanted Elena and Max Ward dead, and they wanted the world to believe they had succeeded. The question that kept him awake, staring at the ceiling and listening for any sound that might indicate danger, was whether helping them would save their lives or seal all their fates. Elena's confession came on the third night, delivered in whispered urgency while Max finally slept peacefully beside an exhausted Josie. The truth was more complex and dangerous than Caleb had imagined, a story of corporate conspiracy and murder that reached into the highest levels of American business and politics. She wasn't just the grieving widow of an oil heir, she had been the operational mind behind Ward Industries' day-to-day management, the MIT-educated engineer who had discovered the massive money laundering scheme running through their offshore drilling platforms and international subsidiaries. Marcus hadn't died in a diving accident, Elena revealed with quiet desperation. He had been murdered the day before he planned to expose his own family's criminal enterprise to federal investigators. The diving trip had been suggested by his uncle Richard, who had arranged for faulty equipment and a remote location where accidents could happen without witnesses. Elena's hospitalization hadn't been for grief, it had been a sophisticated imprisonment, drugs administered to keep her compliant, while the board of directors arranged for her permanent disappearance and the transfer of Max's inheritance to more manageable hands. The helicopter crash had been their final solution, a way to eliminate both Elena and Max while claiming the inheritance through Marcus's uncle, who was already positioned to take control of the company. Elena's escape had been possible only through the help of a psychiatric nurse named Maria Santos, who recognized the signs of forced medication and illegal detention. Together, they had staged Elena's death during a planned transport, using a combination of Elena's inside knowledge of corporate security and Maria's access to medical records to falsify the crash reports. For 3 months, they had lived as ghosts, staying ahead of private investigators and corporate security while Elena gathered evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. She had hidden copies of financial records, communication logs, and documented proof of the money laundering operation in safe deposit boxes across multiple states. But Maria had been caught 2 weeks ago, arrested on fabricated charges that would keep her silenced in federal prison, and Elena knew it was only a matter of time before their location was discovered. Caleb listened to her story with the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to explode in ways he couldn't control or prevent. He had already lost one family to circumstances beyond his control. Now he faced the choice of risking what remained for people he barely knew but had come to care about. But as he watched Max sleep peacefully for the first time since arriving, and saw the hope flickering in Elena's eyes as she spoke of justice for her murdered husband, he realized that some choices made themselves. The decision became inevitable when the first corporate hunter arrived at his garage the next morning, disguised as a customer needing transmission work. The man was professional, polite, and utterly terrifying in his casual assessment of the garage's layout and security measures. He paid for a service he didn't need with crisp $100 bills, asked detailed questions about Caleb's family and business history, and left behind a business card made of gold-plated metal, bearing only an oil derrick symbol and a phone number that Caleb was certain led nowhere safe. That afternoon, a second visitor arrived, a woman in an expensive suit who claimed to be conducting a survey about local businesses for the Chamber of Commerce. She photographed the garage extensively, noted the location of all entrances and exits, and displayed the kind of tactical awareness that suggested military or law enforcement training. When she left, Caleb found a small electronic device attached to the underside of his desk, a listening device so sophisticated that he almost missed it despite his paranoid searching. That night, his world shifted from sanctuary to battleground, the illusion of safety he had built around his family crumbling with terrifying speed. The attack came with surgical precision, designed to send a message rather than inflict immediate harm. Caleb discovered the break-in when his ancient security cameras showed footage of someone moving through his garage with night vision equipment, searching methodically through his files and computer system. His laptop had been compromised, every email and search history copied, his financial records downloaded and analyzed. They had been thorough and professional, leaving no obvious signs of disturbance but making sure he would know they had been there. But the real message arrived on Elena's phone at exactly midnight. A text containing a single photograph of Josie walking out of school, followed by coordinates and a simple ultimatum: game over. Bring the boy to these coordinates by midnight tomorrow, or Josie won't make it home from school next week. We know where she goes, who her friends are, what route she takes home. End this now. The rage that consumed Caleb was unlike anything he had experienced since Sarah's death, a fury so pure and consuming that it temporarily burned away his fear and grief. These people had crossed the one line he had thought was sacred, had turned his daughter into a target, had violated the one boundary he had never expected anyone to cross. Elena found him in his office, hands shaking as he stared at the photograph, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw the firefighter he had once been, the man who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Elena knelt beside his chair, her voice steady despite the terror in her own eyes. I won't let them hurt Josie because of us. We'll leave tonight, right now. You'll never see us again, and they'll have no reason to threaten your daughter. But Caleb was already moving beyond fear into the cold calculation that had once made him effective in emergency situations. No, he said quietly, his voice carrying the same deadly calm he had used to coordinate rescues in burning buildings. We end this. Tonight. The plan began forming with the kind of desperate clarity that came from having nothing